introducing retired Major Paul Handel. Many of you know Paul in different circumstances. Paul's a long-serving member of the society. He's also part of our council. And Paul is speaking to us on a real favourite of his topic, which is the armoured military vehicles in Australia from 1915 to 1945. We can welcome Paul to the podium.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you all for coming here to the presentation today. We're going to have a look at the various equipments that were made before and during World War II, but we won't talk very much about all the goings on between munitions board, governments, army and so on, because that would take up the whole presentation. So we'll start off. All right, the manufacture of armoured vehicles in Australia was very, very small before World War II. It was also hampered by the equipment that we had, by the interest that the government had in making the army a little bit stronger than it was, and of course the effects of World War I, where they wanted to reduce the army to a much smaller size. We'll just digress for a moment and talk about an Australian design of 1912. And this was by an engineer named Sir Eldon de Mol. He was serving in Western Australia, but not in the army, in the industrial side. And he decided, because they had a lot of trouble in WA moving various equipment and so on around, that he needed a track laying vehicle. So he came up with this idea of a track laying vehicle. What we see is a model only, and you can just see the track work. He didn't make any discussion about armour plate or turrets or anything, because that wasn't his, what shall we say, his area. Just on the left side of the presentation of the slide, you'll see a model, and this model still exists at the Australian War Memorial. This is a bit long, but I think it's necessary that we have a look at what went on with his idea. And he did the idea and then he presented it to the War Office in London. And as a result, they didn't particularly like it. It was presented about 3 times, and each time he was rejected. There was a report written after the war by the Royal Commission, and the report that the Commission found was, we consider that Mr. de Mol, and you can read the rest of it, but the paragraph at the top was talking about who didn't like the appreciation and who didn't like the proper report. The chairman of the Royal Commission wrote the item about what he thought of the tank or the track vehicle, and one thing that I would like to mention is that he invention was in advance of his time and failed to be appreciated. But because he did all of these things, he got £965 for all his efforts. In 1915, a group of motor enthusiasts, they had a meeting in Melbourne and discussed the possibility of armoured cars. The armoured cars were to be built on a civilian car chassis, and you can see Mercedes, Daimler, Minerva and motorcycle. These were all donated by many of the motoring enthusiasts who had some money, and of course they donated them. The reason for the different cars is simply because that's all that they had and that's what they were given. And they have to be fairly heavy chassis because of armour plate which would be added after the car was ready. The manufacture of these cars was important because it had no government input whatsoever. The cars were manufactured by various firms in Melbourne, and they were the ones who bore the cost of the vehicles. They completed 2 armoured cars, and the third one was a tender vehicle. So tender vehicles carrying all the supplies and what have you, fuel, water, ammunition. That's the armoured car section as it finished up. So we can see Mercedes, the Minerva tender, the Daimler and the motorcycle combination. You'll see that the 2 armoured cars are different in their outlook, the turrets and the shield and so on, and so there was no compatibility between these vehicles. The unit was formed up in Melbourne after the government decided that an armoured car unit would be fairly useful, and they paraded here, I think it's at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, but I wouldn't be clear, and then they were transferred to Egypt, and they went by ship of course, and they went to Egypt just as they were. No preparation, no nothing. When they arrived in the Middle East, they moved to Minia, and they were camped with some of the British armoured units, and the Brits used Rolls-Royce vehicles, which, as you know, the Rolls-Royce is a bit top of the tree, and they formed the British patrols. Because the vehicles were so heavy, some of the armour plate was removed, and it still didn't make much difference. Even though we had drivers who had lots of experience in the Australian bush, they still couldn't get the cars to drive through the various obstacles that existed in Egypt. And of course the biggest obstacle was sand. So in in 1916, the unit was told to move to Cairo, and they didn't know what that was for, or they had a bit of an idea, and the cars were taken from them, returned to the Ordnance Depot, and then they formed the Australian Light Car Patrol using Ford Model T cars. Now these were open cars with Lewis guns and nothing else, so they were a patrol. But they are the first armoured cars that were built in Australia. They were not paid for by the government. The statement I've got there ensures that you know that the Australian government did not have any part of the manufacture of these vehicles. And that's important to know.
Spanish, they have a German brand, Mercedes.
Of course. Right. In the 1930s, it was decided that the army should now start to have armoured units, not very big ones, and certainly nothing with track-laying vehicles. So the design of a armoured car was brought to the notice of the Munitions Supply Board, and the vehicle was actually built by the Australian government. So that's where the government started to get involved with the purchase of equipment, armoured equipment for them. If you have a look at the armoured car, those of us who know a little bit will see that it looks a little bit like the British Rolls-Royce armoured cars of the time, and there were also Manchesters and other vehicles. The vehicle had a lot of trials, not only within Melbourne, but around Victoria. The car was issued to the 1st Armoured Car Regiment, also known as the Winger Regiment, and they were descended from the 19th Light Horse. So it's a bit complicated, but basically it was 1st Armoured Car Regiment. The Army at that time gave numbers to each of their vehicles, and this one was DD 220, so Department of Defence 220. It's interesting to note that the name corroboree was given to the vehicle by Defence, not by the soldiers. And you'll see as we go along that the remainder of armoured cars that were produced actually had these names, not corroboree, but other First Nation people's names, which is very, very unusual for that period of time. This car is seen driving through the town of Nil. I don't know if anybody knows Nil, but I was asked about that yesterday, and I find that it's a town to the northwest of Melbourne, about 4.5 hours away, and then they did some trials and went across the border into South Australia for about an hour, came back. So that's our first government-built armoured car. The second armoured car to be produced was this armoured car local pattern number 2. It was decided again that the Army needed some vehicles, armoured vehicles that were able to be trained with, not necessarily to go into battle. So you see these chassis and hulls are quite different to the original vehicle that we saw, and the first picture on the left shows them just being delivered. They look really good, really nicely polished. Here we can see the inside of the vehicle, the driver's position, and you can see the door is open. So it's rather a large door. It suits how he sits down, and then there's a photo going from the rear looking forward into the driver's position. Again, the Army gave these the numbers, 221 and 222, Billabong and Boomerang. So we stick again with the First Nations people's names. Number 3, it was decided to make another 6 armoured cars, built at the Ordnance Factory in Armoured, and for the 2nd Armoured Car Regiment, which interestingly was based in Ashfield in Sydney suburb. You'll see that they're generally the same as the number 2 armoured car, except they're a little bit longer and have slightly different hulls. And we see there the vehicles being manufactured at Armoured. Number 3 did a lot of manoeuvres, shall we say, around the New South Wales, but they also did a lot of parades through Sydney. You'll see here the first photo shows a number 3 passing the town hall, obviously on having a saluting diocese on a special parade. The next vehicle shows from the right-hand side, you can see the driver's position, but you can also see the turret. The turret was only a half turret, and when it was parked and needed some shade inside, the canvas cover was raised. A little bit of patting on the back for myself. The 2nd Armoured Car Regiment in Ashfield was on Liverpool Road, and it was in the place where the high school is at the moment. The vehicle is coming down Carlton Crescent, and on the left side of the photo is the ambulance station. So a little bit of personal notes. When I lived in Summerhill, my late uncle was a member of the regiment, and his OC was Major General Sir Denzel MacArthur Onslow. It's said that when the 6th Division, I'm going forward a bit, when the 6th Division were training, a trainload of soldiers were getting out at Ingleburn, and they saw this rather tall, quiet man, and it was asked, "Who's this bloke?" And it was answered, "Well, he's mobbing all the dirt around here." So, and just another point about this, when I enlisted in the army in 1970, I was started up shooting officers get training leader, and it was based in the Moore Park Barracks, which is now some football stadium or something, and it was there that they had a little bit of a do, shall we say, to welcome the new people to the Octube. My uncle was there, and the rest of my family was there, and it was of great interest to me that the General MacArthur Onslow came up to my uncle and said, "G'day, Rolly." And my uncle said, "G'day, Denzel." And of course, being new to the army, I nearly fell over. Number 4 armoured car. They were going to build 15 of these cars, but it was reduced to 9 cars. I think that was because of cost, obviously. And these were issued back to the 1st Armoured Car Regiment. They were fitted with Marmon Harrington front-wheel drive. Marmon Harrington was a company in the United States that did a lot of military equipment, including light tanks and vehicles, and these 4-wheel drive units gave the vehicle much better cross-country performance. All right, we move to the Second World War. So the munitions factories were moving up to a war footing, and they decided again to build some armoured cars. At the beginning of war, we've seen the vehicles just before. There was 18 of them in total, and not very many to be able to use during operations overseas in the Second World War. So the vehicle we see now is the scout car, and also named Dingo. It was 4 wheels, it had 4-wheel drive, and it had a small armoured hull which carried 2 people. Because it's a scout car, you only need to go out and have a look and see what's going on. The armoured hull sloped at the rear, I think because there was an ability to give an all-round vision, which you do in reconnaissance. And here we show a munitions parade in Sydney, and you'll see quite a few of the Dingoes, and right behind you will see the Australian cruiser tank, which we'll talk about later on. You'll see that the commander is giving a few hurrahs to the crowd, and luckily the driver didn't do that. It was quite a heavy vehicle for its day, being 4.5 tonnes. So there were a number of modifications made to the vehicle to try and give it much more cross-country ability. They weren't really successful, but the vehicle was still used for training. We can see that 245 vehicles were built. That is a pretty good number of vehicles for the first effort in armoured cars during the Second World War. So you can see how much further the munitions industry had come since 1937 and 38. The next armoured car they built was the Rover light armoured car. It was known to the soldiers as the mobile slip trench, mainly because it was long, open at the top, and just like the hole that you dig in the ground. An experimental model was made by Ruskin Motor Body Works. Now they are a firm in Melbourne. The pilot model was inspected by the General Staff, and so it was allowed that these vehicles be purchased and built. The technical aspects of the vehicles down the bottom was that the standard truck chassis for a Ford was 158 inches. Now I apologise for not using metric terminology. The second lot of vehicles had the chassis shortened, and the third lot were exactly the same as the prototypes that we see above. Total 238 armoured vehicles. Again, another very good effort by the industry and the munitions factories. Here we see the car again. The Victorian Railways did a lot of fabrication of steel, and so they were instrumental in fabricating the hulls. You must remember that this was armour plate steel, which has a different method of welding to put the steel together to make an armoured vehicle. So we can see here, the first photo shows a long wheelbase, so one of the first ones, and the second photo shows a shorter wheelbase, shows you the doors in the back of the hull, which the troops had to exit through, and again, another parade to show how wonderful their equipment is. The third and last armoured car was the heavy armoured car, known as the Rhino. There was a lot of controversy about this vehicle. It went back and forth in the design phase between General Staff, between the munitions board, between the Army. I won't go into that area because that will give us about 2 hours to listen to. They only made 2, and they were built on a GM 6-cylinder engine. The the chassis and the engines were to come from General Motors in Canada, and the armoured car was designed around that. You can see that unfortunately the ship sank on the way, so all the 130 chassis went to the bottom. We can also say that the project was sank. Alright, we move on to tracked vehicles. In the first instance, when it was decided to build tracked vehicles which were supporting or allocated to the infantry, they needed a little bit of a design example. So this was the machine gun carrier that was brought to Australia from England, and it was used as a pattern for our vehicles. Our vehicles were a little bit different to these, and nevertheless they proved very good. Just as a note, the nomenclature of the vehicles, we called them machine gun carriers because they mounted a Vickers gun. The vehicles did not have Brent guns at this stage because Brent guns were very, very sparse on the Australian armoured force, military forces. So the POMs called them Bren gun carriers. A lot of people out here also call them Bren gun carriers, but the Army actually called them machine gun carriers. So this is what we came up with. Machine gun carrier vocal pattern number 1, also known as MG carrier LP1 or carrier machine gun brackets OST number 1. So there were several designations for it. The vehicle was built in various places around Australia, and you'll see that being based on the British carrier, it was very, very similar. Only 160 of these carriers were built, and some 15 of them were taken to the Middle East. The force that took them to the Middle East also had to move to Greece to do some fighting, and when we left Greece in a hurry and withdrew to Crete, the vehicles were left behind. That's what number 1 looked like. As you can see, almost the same as the British vehicles, except with the Vickers gun. And you'll see that we have entrenching tools, spades and what have you, on the left-hand side of the vehicle, which the British ones did not have. A couple of photos showing the vehicles under construction. You can see them lined up at Islington Works, and also at the right-hand side, a much more detailed photo showing some workmen doing extra work at the rear of the vehicle. Again, we like to show the flag of all our equipment, and so you'll see a line of carriers and you will see how long the line is. So there was a lot of vehicles being paraded. And on the right you can see how they were paraded, generally with the commander standing out the top of the vehicle on the left-hand side, the driver on the right-hand side, and one of the crew members in the rear. They were used in training quite a bit, and you can see the areas that they had to train in. We had going over logs, driving down embankments, going through mud and all those sort of things. And there's a couple of photos which I've seen of carriers, virtually every Australian armoured vehicle bashing through trees. So that seemed to be the thing to do when you made the armoured vehicle. You bashed it through trees to see how good it was. Of course, some years ago when I was helping out at the Engineer Museum and spoke something about something like this, a little girl from one of the schools said, "Does the army knock down trees?" So after that, I've been very careful in what I say. These two photos of the vehicles captured in Crete. You could see that the Germans are there looking at it, but on the right-hand side, on the back of the carrier on the lower hull, you'll see a 6th Division sign, meaning that yes, they definitely were Australian and definitely were captured. And I don't know if the Germans used them at all or to any extent if they did. The number 2 carrier. This was a development, again looked like one of the British carriers. Again, mounting a Vickers gun, not a Bren gun. You'll see there several of the companies that manufactured the vehicles, and there were also plenty of subcontractors who made various parts for the vehicle. Over 5,000 were produced, and that's a pretty good effort for the Australian industry at that time. There were a number of variants. Some were agreed to by the government, some were unit ones. So there was a little bit of difference there. And we'll have a look at some of those. There's a lineup of number 2s. Firstly, one on parade, and the second one in the ordnance depot being checked over. You can see some have camouflage, some don't have camouflage. You wouldn't believe Australians training in the snow. There they are. And I've seen another couple of photos of the vehicle from the rear, and they have a canopy over it, and there's the crew in there, I won't say freezing, but pretty cold. And on the right, how you disembark for a carrier if you're an infantryman. Just jump over the side. The vehicles stayed on after the war, and this one was used in Korea, a number of which used in Korea. You'll see on the side of the vehicle it has a roundel like aircraft do. That was soon changed to a star, US star, because they could not identify the roundel and probably would shoot at it. One of the modifications was to fit a flamethrower to the carrier. You'll see that it has a very, very long range, probably about 100 metres. Did we use those in action? No. They decided to see if the vehicles would forward, that means cross a river by itself with no extra bits on board. Then they tried wading the carrier, which means they had a little bit of a screen, vertical, and you could sort of float the vehicle. The picture on the right-hand side, the lower one, looks like they're trying to swim in the ocean. I won't say the ocean, but a very rough sea. And there's other pictures of this with just head showing of the soldiers. Two variants which were made by government, not by units, and these are the 3-inch mortar carrier and the 2-pounder carrier. The 2-pounder carrier, you can see, has a 2-pounder anti-tank gun mounted on the rear on a turntable. The mortar carrier, just inside, you can see the 3-inch mortar assembled and curved boxes around which carried mortar bombs and other equipment. I believe that the first, or the only 400 of the vehicles were sent to Chinese nationalist forces, and they were training in India. I've only seen one photograph of a normal LP2 carrier with Chinese soldiers, and it was not a mortar carrier. However, that's what the books say, so that's what you've got to go by. One of the last vehicles to be looked at was the tracked truck. A very interesting name, because even though it used carrier components, it was not armoured, and it could tow artillery pieces and trailers through the jungle. The Jeeps towing trailers were very good, however, in a lot of cases they used to bog, and they bogged down fairly deeply. So this unit was invented, and it was fairly good. Unfortunately, only 12 were made. I understand that one went to the UK for trials, and the report said that it overheats. Now, why an Australian vehicle would overheat in England, I don't know. We're going to talk about the most ambitious project that we entered into during the war as far as armoured vehicles are concerned. That is the Australian cruiser tank. Its name was the Sentinel, but that was a little bit after it was started. So we couldn't get armour and a lot of weapons from England, because England was under pressure from the withdrawal from France, and their factories were really going full pelt to make vehicles for themselves. The engines for a lot of US vehicles came from aircraft engines, and so the original proposal for the Australian cruiser tank was that it used rated aircraft engines. These engines were not available, so we had to go and look at some other ways of doing things. We'll come to that in a moment. You'll see here the engineering workshops that were used in the construction of the tank, and I show my age when I remember doing engineering apprenticeship in the late 60s. I remember half of those companies, and actually very local. The hull of the vehicle was to be cast steel, because we could not get flat plate, or flat armour plate. Most of it was being used for ship manufacture. It was to mount a 2-pounder gun with 2 Vickers guns mounted in it. As we noted, the engine supply was rather difficult, so we had 3 Cadillac engines mounted in what they call a clover leaf design. There was a frame, the engines were mounted on it, and they drove a common crankshaft. A lot of trials were undertaken, many at Monaghan, the Army's proving ground, a lot around Melbourne, and there was a special trial with 2 tanks driving from Liverpool to Melbourne. Now that's quite a long way, as we know, especially if you're driving a tank. I believe that one of the tanks had a failure of one of the engines, but it still got there. That's just a little sign to say how marvellous we are. And that was in the factory. You'll see this photograph again, so I apologise for it. Here is the first tank. E1 was the designation, and this came out of the railway workshops at Everley. That's just down the road, or was. You can see here all the workers standing around. You'll see that the tank has steel tracks, which is pretty good. The turret is mounted, and you'll see that the turret is angled both one way and the other, outwards and inwards. And this was to deflect the rounds from enemy weapons. Mind you, sloping it on the lower side would assist the round to go straight into the tank. Okay, excuse me. We appear to have lost the rest of it. Yeah, all my important ones are not there. They were showing individual components of the tank, the cast hull and the cast turret, the final drive, which is the area which rolls the track, the Cadillac engines, which I was very keen to show you, and the vehicles were finally assembled at Chorley Railway Works, and then they were taken on a test track. The test track went around as far as Villawood in Sydney and then returned. So that is one of the tanks moving up the hill. Just excuse me for a moment. Sorry, we brought it back up. Yes, my apologies for this. All right, I'm sorry, the backup isn't there. Yeah. Excuse me again. My apologies for this. They were working this morning when I checked it, so I don't know what has happened. Maybe another day we can talk about the Australian cruiser tank. The vehicle we see here is the Scout Car S1. These were made in Australia for the US forces, and they were to be used for airfield guards and so on. Guarding installations, guarding soldiers on exercise. They were open-topped, very similar in design to the white Scout car, which some of you may know. The interesting thing is, a lot of ours were left-hand drive because we used American chassis. This one is right-hand drive because we used Australian chassis. You'll see here that they would appear to be the only Australian wheeled vehicle to be used overseas. These were, the photos were taken in the Philippines, and there's one right at the back in the first photo. The other two vehicles show it as probably a food wagon or something like that. What have we got today as far as armoured vehicles concerned? Well, there we go. We've got Bushmaster and we've got Hawkeye. These are the last Australian armoured vehicles to be made at the present time. So we see Bushmaster. There's been a lot of interest in Bushmaster overseas, and we have sent some to the Ukraine. The ones in Ukraine do very well. I believe there's only one been damaged at this point in time, and if they could, they would like more. Various other countries around the world have bought them, and Netherlands are one of them. There's even some being sold to Southeast Asian nations. The Hawkeye is a mobility vehicle which carries 4 soldiers. It's like an armoured Land Rover. It has various combinations, and they are pretty good vehicles. I don't know why they weren't sent overseas to Ukraine, because I understand that they were asked for. Now, I've got a couple of ideas, but I wouldn't like to say so. All right, that ends my partial presentation, and my apologies for its demise, and perhaps one day we can have a quick look at the Australian cruiser tank and all the components that they have. Thank you all for coming.
As you mentioned, the 66 of the cruisers that Tammy would build. I've seen one sitting in the law section out of the Wollongong. What happened to the rest of them?
Well, the rest of them we use for training purposes, and then at the end of the war, I believe they were broken up. The one that you see at Trelaw is actually what they call an AC3, which is Australian Cruiser Tank Mark III. It has a sloping glassy plate. It doesn't have the machine gun in the hull, and it mounts a 25-pounder gun. That again is the only one missing there. I won't say that that was taken from Puckapunga, because the Royal Australian Armoured Corps Association wanted a monument, and that went to the mountain, the mountain on the top of Duntru.
Interesting that all the vehicles up to now all have American engines in them, which is a bit strange. I spent 8 months in the defensive study course. I was on civilian, but we were doing work with the military. And they were pointing out during the war that films like Hoover, vacuum cleaners and washing machines, up on the Paranara River, within 6 months they converted making a washing machine to one that gas and carries, showing what happens when you actually have an industry that can convert, which of course we now don't have.
That's exactly right. We had a little chat this morning with a couple of gentlemen here, and it goes to show you what can be done if industry takes the lead. What should happen is that Army should make a specification, then it goes to various contractors to see what they can make, and sometimes they're trialled, sometimes they're not, and then whoever wins the trial goes into manufacture. The only thing I don't understand with that is after a trial they decide on a vehicle, and then now it's called the preferred tenderer. Now if you're the preferred tenderer, you can basically do what you like, especially with money. So that's my opinion, so I won't go any further.
As a young child, Paul, Artillery Hill outside of Canberra, on the top of that hill, there was a monument up there, and indeed that's where one of the cruiser tanks sat.
That's where the cruiser tank went to Trelaw. It came from the top of the hill and was sent to Trelaw. Fortunately, they didn't cover it up. It was saved and now in the Australian War Memorial. Probably in the annex.
Yes.
John?
Paul, if I understand correctly, the only Australian-made army vehicles which went into action were the vehicles which went to Greece.
Well, there was the LP2 vehicles fought in the New Guinea campaign before the Stuart-like tanks went into action in Boona. There was a succession of attacks by outside forces, infantry, and they were supported by LP2 carriers. The LP2s were seen around. They used some in Borneo, so yes, we did use them overseas. The LP1s were basically Middle East and not used in our sector.
Good, I guess, thank Paul.